Welcome to my new video series for October. It's that spooky time of year that many of us really enjoy. And as most of you know, I am a horror suspense author, and I've published 4 short story collections under the Creation of Chaos series, and I've also published 2 novels as well. Now I'm going to present you with an audio version of my short story, A Red Mist Upon New Orleans. It's a frightening story I came up with after watching a documentary about the Ursuline convent in New Orleans and its rich history. And I had never written a vampire story before, so it seemed like those 2 worlds collided, and this is my offering to the genre. In my story, though, the hunters are now the hunted. So you'll have to see what that's about. If you would, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you thought about the story, and if you like this kind of stuff here on the channel and want to see more. You can go to my website. That's petealtieri.com. I've got a bookstore there. You can read free samples, and do some digging if you like, and purchase stuff from the store securely. Thanks for checking this out, and don't mind that red mist coming down out of the attic. Nothing to see here.
A Red Mist Upon New Orleans. Written and narrated by Pete Altieri. Damn spirits, all that in crossways and floods have burial, already to their wormy beds are gone. For fear lest day should look their shames upon, they willfully themselves exile from light, and must for an eye consort with black-brown night. William Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Part 1. A tall man in a dark trench coat made his way across the bricks of Charter Street as a fine drizzle came down nearly sideways in the strong December wind. The year was 1910. He emerged from the shadows but was illuminated by strong beams from the electric arc streetlights that shined with the power of 2,000 candles each. His shoes made a clicking sound as he moved with a purpose. The collar of his coat was up, covering most of his face. Only his blue eyes shone beneath the brim of an English wool bowler hat, which kept concealed his dark brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. He was holding the handle of a black leather bag, which one would assume was for a medical doctor going to tend to a sick patient. That assumption would have been incorrect. He arrived at the back door of the Ursuline convent at a predetermined time. It was 9 p.m. exactly. As he requested, the light next to the door was turned off, so no one would see him going inside. He paused for a moment in front of the door before it quietly opened and he was allowed entry. "Gabriel," said the young Ursuline nun in a quiet whisper, shutting the door behind him, "everyone is asleep." She smiled at him and touched his face. Gabriel's eyes met hers. He pulled her close and gave her a soft kiss on the lips. "That's good, Elizabeth," he said, getting back to his serious frame of mind. There was dangerous business to be taken care of. She loved the feeling of his warm breath on her lips. "I can't wait for this to be over." Gabriel nodded quickly. In his mind, he was retracing the steps of the plan established back at his hotel room. So many thoughts were fluttering through his mind. From her pocket, Sister Elizabeth gave him a long skeleton key. His right hand held on firmly to the leather bag he carried with the implements of his craft. Gabriel St. Pierre was the best in the world at what he was sent across the continent to do on this night. He was paid a handsome sum to get the job done, but he was subjecting himself to tremendous risk in the process. He thrived on the danger for the past 20 years in the craft. The young nun turned and walked toward the staircase in her black habit and stocking feet, to avoid waking any of the other nuns. There was no sound as she seemed to glide across the wood floor. Gabriel followed a breath behind her as his stomach began to tighten at the thought of what he was there to do. No matter how many times he had performed the task, it was never an easy proposition. He consciously steadied his breathing. All of the angst and concern seemed to bring his attention to an incredible focus. As Gabriel slowly ascended the narrow back staircase that led to the attic, Elizabeth stood vigil at the bottom. She watched him disappear into the darkness. Only the slight creaks let her know how far Gabriel had gone. She counted the 24 steps earlier that day, so she knew when he would reach the locked door. Elizabeth observed which boards creaked and practiced it well. Now she waited patiently. She was also anticipating the actions that were about to happen. Her mind was filled with the many possibilities and ways things could go well or horribly wrong. No scenario she dreamed of would fall into middle ground. It was one extreme or the other. No one was allowed into the attic. Only Reverend Mother Angelica had the key, and it was kept in a special hiding spot. Elizabeth found the secret location and took the key when Reverend Mother was in the dining room eating her dinner with the rest of the nuns. She managed to sneak away for a few minutes, picked up the key, and kept it in the pocket of her habit. This was the story she told Gabriel anyway. Sister Elizabeth had gotten good at sneaking around the convent at night. She met Gabriel a year ago when he was in New Orleans on church business, and the two managed to sneak off while he was in town. The suave Gabriel was enticed and aroused by the idea of feasting on forbidden fruit. She was beautiful, with intense hazel eyes and a captivating smile. Gabriel reached the landing at the top of the stairs and faced a locked, heavy wood door. He set his bag down for a moment while he took the key and placed it into the lock. He readied himself and took a deep breath. He didn't hear Sister Elizabeth coming up the stairs behind him. In her stocking feet and slight frame, she was silent. As seasoned a professional as Gabriel was, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face in that attic. The attic where the 7 trunks were stored when Elizabeth and the other 6 nuns arrived from France 11 years before. They made passage across the Atlantic with the locked trunks and instructed Reverend Mother they were to be stored in the attic. No one asked what was inside. The black leather bag at Gabriel's feet kept an assortment of tools he needed to get the job done. There were 7 wood spikes with silver tips, approximately 12 inches long and sharpened to a point. They were custom made by a master carpenter in Quebec City for Gabriel. He also had a heavy wood mallet, a large metal crucifix, several cloves of garlic, a vial of holy water, and a Bible. He also carried a loaded revolver in his coat pocket in case he met with resistance. This was the toolkit of a vampire hunter. Gabriel St. Pierre was the son of Edward St. Pierre, a legend throughout Europe during the latter part of the 19th century, and grandson of Jacques St. Pierre, the first in a line of vampire hunters about whom harrowing stories were told. They were treated like royalty wherever they went. Each of the St. Pierre vampire hunters had a unique gift the Catholic Church believed was a sort of divine intervention, something to help them eradicate evil from the planet. These St. Pierres could see the vampires leave their lair, while others could not. The vampires cloaked themselves in a red mist that kept them hidden until they were ready to feed, and by then it would be too late for the victims. No one was able to see this mist, and it kept them invisible. The vampire hunters used this gift to track the location of their target and find where they were sleeping. They would attack swiftly while the vampire slumbered, driving a wood spike directly into their heart to stop them from returning from the dead again. It was certainly not a job for the faint at heart. The St. Pierre men were born for the task. Every night since his arrival a week before, Gabriel stood outside the Ursuline convent and observed from the dark crevices of Charter Street as the red mist began to creep from around the dormer windows that lined the attic on the north and south sides of the convent roof. From the 6 windows on each side, the mist moved its way down the white stucco-covered brick facade and to the plush grounds. It moved like a dense red cloud, cloaking the vampires within. As it moved into the streets, the red mist dissipated, and the vampires were loose for the evening. They would return before dawn to the safety of the trunks in the attic. This happened each night at precisely 10:10 p.m. Gabriel knew if he was to strike, it had to be after the nuns were asleep and before the vampires awoke from their slumber to prey upon the transient people of New Orleans. This had been their feeding ground, and the Ursuline Monastery in Quebec City decided it needed to stop before the upcoming Mardi Gras in February. With so many people missing, a scared city turned to the Ursuline sisters to help them, and Quebec City didn't want to let them down. As Gabriel began to turn the key, he had no idea Sister Elizabeth was only 2 steps behind him, carrying a large butcher knife from the kitchen. Neither did he realize that 6 more of her sisters were also on the staircase, slowly inching their way closer with knives in hand. Part 2. It was July 1899, and the Grimaude set sail from Saint-Tropez, a small coastal town on the French Riviera. It was bound for the United States, and with a few stops along the way. A small Ursuline church and convent in nearby Gasson were sending 7 exemplary young nuns to a convent in New Orleans to help spread the word of God and teach the young ladies of the city how to lead good Christian lives with traditional French values. The church felt instilling good Christian values into these American women was an important foundation to build a society upon. The nuns spoke both French and English fluently. The Ursuline convents had already established themselves as the leader in education of women throughout the world. They had been sending nuns to New Orleans and cities throughout the United States for the last 30 years with tremendous success. The 7 nuns spent the day in Saint-Tropez enjoying the wonderful summer weather and spectacular ocean views. Their chaperone gave them a tour of a fine art gallery, a vineyard, and the historic St. Paul's Catholic Church located in the original downtown. It was after their visit to the church, on their way to dinner, that something went terribly wrong. They were intercepted by a group of men who forced the nuns into an empty retail store a block from St. Paul's. The ruffians knew their schedule, paid their chaperone to lead them to a specific location, and waited for the unsuspecting women. Once subdued, the nuns were strangled with a garrote and stripped of their habits and personal things. Their naked bodies were placed in barrels in the cellar of the building and covered with tarps. The 7 other young women dressed in their habits and assumed the identities of the nuns. No one would ever know the difference. The substitute nuns had been groomed for this mission and had received extensive training to fool the convent in New Orleans. Each of the nuns had a large rectangular trunk for her belongings, approximately 6 feet long by 2 feet wide and by 2 feet tall. They appeared large enough to hold much more than one nun's personal items and were built sturdy with inch-thick plywood and brass hardware. The organization that sent the 7 imposters paid the additional charges to ship the heavy trunks, also known as caskets, across the ocean. There were hundreds of other trunks, suitcases, boxes, and other items stored for the passengers making the journey. Their containers drew no attention. The men that organized this devious plan were part of an underground coven of black magic warlocks and witches from Marseille. Their leader, G. Moreau Durand, claimed to have been a descendant of the 14th century French knight, lord, and killer of children, Gilles de Rais. The organization, La Campagne Noire, translated to Company of the Black, was founded in Paris in 1809 and were well funded by friends in major cities throughout Europe. Their membership was comprised of wealthy and well-connected men and women. La Campagne Noire were aware of the Catholic Church's attempts to spread their word in the United States and wanted nothing more than to sabotage their efforts. These 7 women were transporting male vampires in the caskets. The interior of the trunks were lined with French soil, so to make the journey more bearable to the occupants. The young women were trained for months on their mission in the New World and had to act like an Ursuline nun and had to protect their cargo with their lives. The voyage to New York took the 7 women 38 days to complete. The vampires were let out of their trunks once a week to feed on small children and the rats that infested the ship. They took an additional week to arrive by train with their trunks in New Orleans. Aside from the extreme boredom, the trip was uneventful, and each of the 7 women made it in good health, anxious to begin the next phase of their diabolical plan. Part 3. The 7 were able to convince Reverend Mother Angelica, the head nun at the Ursuline convent, they were the ones sent from France. She had no reason to suspect anything else. She did find it odd the women traveled with large trunks, but stored them in the attic as they requested. She was grateful to have them in New Orleans, as 3 of the older nuns were ready to retire and 4 others were being transferred to various locations in the United States. The Reverend Mother welcomed the young nuns to her staff to help in the chores necessary to keep the convent going and to spread the gospel with the heathens of the city. There were countless souls to save. The vampires began to feed from the population of New Orleans without much concern they would draw attention to the Ursuline convent. Who would suspect such a thing? They had more than enough victims in the flourishing city on the Mississippi that was filled with prostitutes, drunks, orphans, and transient laborers that would not be missed by anyone. It was the ideal hunting ground, and the vampires were pleasantly sated. Within 2 years, the 7 nuns had established themselves firmly with the Reverend Mother and with Father Michael from the chapel on the grounds. The older nuns retired or were sent to other parishes, so the 7 young nuns were the only ones at the convent with the Reverend Mother. They worked very hard as instructed. They were able to keep an eye on the trunks in the attic and make sure no one got suspicious and wanted to take a look. They had one close call in 1903 when an exterminator wanted to set some rat traps in the attic during the height of a rodent epidemic in New Orleans. The 7 nuns convinced the man he didn't need to do that since they had not seen any rats. Any animal would cringe at the idea of going into the convent, sensing the presence of the vampires, supreme hunters of all living things. Birds were seldom seen in any of the trees on the property, and the flower gardens were free of bees and other insects. The keen survival instinct of any creature would keep it far away from the Ursuline convent on Charter Street. As the years went on, the city of New Orleans was getting a flood of complaints about strange sightings in the French Quarter. People reported seeing ghouls and men that looked like walking corpses in the small hours near the convent. The descriptions were hideous and sounded like the stuff of nightmares. The police assumed these events were from tourists with overactive imaginations from the many ghost stories that seemed to permeate New Orleans. Word of this became known to the Ursuline convent and chapel, which was concerning to those at the North American headquarters in Quebec City, Quebec in Canada. In 1909, Quebec City sent a group of 4 young priests to investigate the claims. The priests spoke to police officers and read the various reports of the ghoulish sightings. They spoke with the nuns and Reverend Mother at the convent and the priest at the chapel, but none of them had observed any suspicious activity. With all the evidence they pored over, the priests were sure these vampires were at work in the city of New Orleans. Upon returning to Quebec City with their findings, the priests recommended they send the church's expert on such matters. Gabriel St. Pierre was known throughout the world as an exceptional vampire hunter. The son of Edward St. Pierre and the grandson of Jacques St. Pierre came from rare stock and was the obvious choice to send to New Orleans to check on the matter thoroughly. Bishop O'Reilly agreed it was time to bring in Gabriel to check out these suspicions. He was the best in the business. It was during his visit in the summer of 1910 that Gabriel St. Pierre was introduced to a Sister Elizabeth at the Ursuline convent. While he found it odd the nun followed him around like a lovesick schoolgirl, he also found it thrilling. Though he could only see her face, the young nun was beautiful, with piercing hazel eyes that were on his mind no matter what else he was doing in New Orleans during his visit. Gabriel made it a point to visit the convent more than necessary in the name of getting to the bottom of the problem, though he was doing whatever he could to catch a glimpse of Sister Elizabeth. Part 4. Sister Elizabeth played along very well to the notion that Gabriel believed she was a young woman in love. She batted her eyes and made sure he caught her staring at him while he made his rounds at the convent during his visit. She knew who Gabriel St. Pierre was. La Campagne Noire informed all the women about him in case they might see the dreaded vampire hunter in their midst. With the precious cargo they were in charge of protecting, La Campagne Noire knew Gabriel St. Pierre was the only man they did not want to see poking around. The last day of Gabriel's visit to New Orleans, he stopped by the convent to thank the Reverend Mother for her hospitality and assistance on the matter. He arrived in a gray 3-piece suit and English wool bowler hat. His blue eyes sparkled as he waited in the lobby for the Reverend Mother to greet him. "Wonderful! I was hoping to see you before I board the train in 2 hours," Gabriel said, his hat in his hands. "Yes, I'm glad you stopped by, Mr. St. Pierre," Reverend Mother said, smiling. She had a round, matronly face. Sister Elizabeth heard Gabriel's voice. She was doing her chores in the kitchen and quickly dried off her hands before walking into the lobby. "Are you leaving us, Mr. St. Pierre?" Sister Elizabeth asked. She knew exactly when he was leaving, but had become good at acting since arriving at the convent. "Yes, my train leaves in 2 hours, but I had one more thing I wanted to see you ladies about before I go." "Yes, of course," Reverend Mother said. "Would you like some coffee?" Gabriel smiled. "No, thank you. I'd like to take a look in the attic. It seems that's the only place on the grounds I haven't been." Elizabeth did her best to contain her concern. The last thing she needed was the inquisitive Gabriel St. Pierre looking around in the attic. "Yes, of course, Mr. St. Pierre. Let me get you the key," Reverend Mother said. Within a minute she returned, handing the key to Sister Elizabeth. "Sister, please take Mr. St. Pierre to the attic and let him do what he needs to do. I have a meeting at the chapel with Father Michael about the Christmas program this year." Sister Elizabeth led the way up the steep staircase that went to the attic. There were cobwebs in places. It was obvious no one had been on the stairs in some time. "This is quite the climb," Gabriel said as they made their way to the stair landing at the top. Sister Elizabeth could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, not from the stairs, but because she was afraid Gabriel would figure out where the vampires had been sleeping. She knew of his uncanny abilities, but wasn't sure exactly what that meant and how he was able to seek them out. She was concerned he would ruin a good thing. So much work had gone into the ruse, and Le Compagnie Noir had been extremely pleased things had gone so well since their arrival in New Orleans. Her mind was racing to come up with something to distract Gabriel. Sister Elizabeth turned the key in the locked door and slowly opened it. It let out an extended creaking sound as she did so. The air smelled stale. As the two entered the dark attic, Sister Elizabeth reached up and quickly unscrewed the light bulb by the door, just enough without Gabriel noticing. "That's strange," Sister Elizabeth said. A clicking noise came from the light switch by the door. It was an old knob and tube push button that made a loud noise when it was switched on or off. The bulb must have gone out. Sister Elizabeth slowly shut the door behind them and locked it without Gabriel realizing. In deep thought, he strained his eyes to see in the dark attic. It was a large walkable space with plywood floors and exposed wood rafters which comprised the support of the pitched roof. With the dormer windows closed and shuttered, there was very little light coming in. Slowly his eyes began to adjust, but it was difficult to make out what was stored in the attic. He saw a 6-foot table with various objects on it, but not much else. Suddenly, he felt a hand touch his arm, and he recoiled, startled by it. It was Sister Elizabeth. She reached out and took his large hand in hers. Gabriel felt a tingling sensation across his body. He wasn't sure what to do. He didn't expect the young nun to act on her obvious feelings towards him. She was a nun, after all. "Don't tell me you don't feel this too," Sister Elizabeth said as she gently pulled him toward her. "Yes, but you're a—" Gabriel started, but she placed a finger to his lips. "Don't fight it, Gabriel," Sister Elizabeth said as she pulled the white wimple from her head. A head of long blonde hair cascaded past her shoulders. Gabriel was taken aback by Sister Elizabeth's actions, and he was extremely excited about it. He glanced to the door and noticed it was closed. "It's locked, and we have the only key," she said, loosening her belt and taking the black tunic off. Beneath her habit was the body of a young woman in her late 20s. Gabriel was almost 40, but considered himself a bit of a ladies' man. A nun coming to him was uncharted territory, and he was not used to women being so bold and in control. He became instantly aroused at the sight of her thin, shapely body. He reached down and placed his right hand beneath her chin and gently angled her face toward his. They passionately kissed, groping at each other as he removed his clothes in the dark confines of the attic. Gabriel had no idea the 7 caskets were safely stored about 15 feet away along the west wall. Part 5. Gabriel St. Pierre left the Ursuline convent an hour later and was smiling on the train headed for Niagara Falls, New York, where he was scheduled to take another train to Ottawa and then a third to Quebec City. The council at the monastery wanted desperately to hear what Gabriel had to say. They preferred not to talk to him on the phone, telegraph, or by mail about the situation in New Orleans. They wanted to hear it directly from Gabriel's lips. "Gentlemen, I feel there are vampires at work in New Orleans. I am sure of it, he told the boardroom filled with priests and administrators who waited with bated breath. They went on to discuss the possible locations the vampires could be using for their lair. Gabriel told them he was not sure of that, but based on the evidence presented to him and his interviews with various people at the church and the city, he knew vampires were the cause of the rash of missing people. With such a long history of vampirism in New Orleans, it was staggering to think of how many vampires they had created in the population, though most left the area to travel the world in search of fresh victims. There were other cities in the United States that reported a significant rise in missing persons cases and strange sightings. Many citizens were claiming to see monsters or ghoulish people walking the streets late at night. They were frantic when reporting the sightings, so police believed they were intoxicated or making it up. The council unanimously voted to send Gabriel St. Pierre back to New Orleans in December to further investigate the location of the vampires so he could rid the city of them. It was decided the holiday season would provide a good distraction and not draw undue attention to what he was really doing in New Orleans. They agreed upon a price for him to carry out this task and whatever travel and lodging would be required. Gabriel was more than happy to return to New Orleans so he could taste the fruit of the beautiful young nun, Sister Elizabeth. When he thought about how stupid it was to fraternize with the young nun and how that would destroy his reputation with the church if they were found out, Gabriel's hubris and machismo stood up and took over. He couldn't think about much else than how she looked spread out on that attic floor, her tunic laid out beneath her like a blanket. December could not come fast enough. Part 6. Gabriel arrived in New Orleans by train in early December 1910. He made reservations at the luxurious St. Charles Hotel, a mere 2 miles from the Ursuline convent. He made a dinner reservation at the trendy Court of the Two Sisters restaurant on Royal Street. Gabriel requested a certain table that was in a dark area of the room, which overlooked the steamboats moving slowly along the Mississippi River. He could think of no other perfect location to meet Sister Elizabeth for a romantic dinner. She had arranged for the night off and was planning to spend it with him at the St. Charles Hotel. The morning after their night at the hotel, Gabriel sat on the balcony enjoying a cigarette and a cup of coffee while Elizabeth slept soundly in the king-size bed. Something had been gnawing at him since she arrived at the restaurant. He felt an odd sensation as they sat at the table, enjoying dinner, the view of the river, and each other's company. He couldn't put his finger on it at the time, but it seemed like something was off with the beautiful woman. In his years as a vampire hunter, he learned to trust his instincts. He wondered if maybe it was all in his head, or that maybe their 6 months apart had changed how they felt about each other. Had she regretted what happened between them in the dark confines of the attic? Did she experience guilt at the breaking of her vow to God? Gabriel wasn't sure what it was, but something was not right. He did his best to keep up appearances and make Elizabeth think he was still taken by her as he was that day in July when they made love in the attic. Gabriel found it odd that she didn't feel like a virgin when he was inside her. He had never been with a virgin before, so he couldn't be sure. In the dark, he didn't notice if she bled afterward. Gabriel and Elizabeth enjoyed a wonderful dinner and walked by the river in the moonlight. With her in a beautiful blue dress and her hair down, Gabriel wasn't concerned anyone would recognize her. She looked nothing like the young nun at the convent. They made love twice at the hotel before they collapsed on the bed after midnight. There was still something going on with her. Gabriel was sure of it. He kept up the charade of his role as the adoring lover. As he watched the sun come up, things came into focus for him. He had seen the red mist coming from the attic. His eyes didn't lie. He knew those vampires were up there. Gabriel wondered why he didn't see it before, but he knew his lust for the young woman clouded his usual good judgment, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Part 7. During their entire dinner, Elizabeth felt something was off with Gabriel. She wondered if he discovered she wasn't really a nun. La Campagne Noire assured her there would be no way for him to find out. They covered their tracks well and had too many people in high places that provided the necessary documents to satisfy inquiries. Still, Elizabeth was concerned. She also didn't like being away from the convent. Her main mission was to protect the trunks in the attic. They made love at the hotel, and Elizabeth could see it in his eyes that something was bothering Gabriel. It was as if he was there in body, but his mind was somewhere else. She did find him attractive, and during her time at the convent, it was rare that she could find herself in private with a man, though she had a few times before meeting him. She had to be very careful, but she was a young woman with needs. Once she knew the church had sent Gabriel St. Pierre to the convent, every thought she had was stopping him. 6 other women who came up with her from France were her allies, but Reverend Mother and Father Michael were not. She wasn't sure what her next move was, but she was keeping an eye on Gabriel. She also couldn't let on that she knew something was amiss. The fact the church sent him back concerned her. There had to be a good reason for him to return. She saw a large black leather bag on the dresser, partially covered with an overcoat. She knew what that was. It was the kit of a vampire killer. She studied that back at the church in Gasson, France. They warned the girls about the prominent vampire killers operating in the world, and number 1 on that list was Gabriel St. Pierre. Just the name St. Pierre gave her a chill. There were legendary stories told of his father, Edward, and the many vampires he slayed in Germany, France, and throughout the United Kingdom. There were even more about his grandfather, Jacques, who had statues of his likeness placed in prominent places in the major cities in Europe. Everyone knew of the St. Pierres and their unnatural gift to see vampires when others could not. As she laid on the bed, appearing to be asleep in the early morning hours, she kept one eye on Gabriel as he sat on the balcony drinking his coffee. She wished she were able to read his mind. Part 8. Elizabeth, I've got something to ask you, Gabriel said, sitting on the edge of the bed as she appeared to struggle to wake up. Yes, what is it? She stretched big, wondering what it was he was going to ask her. I can't think of any other way to say this, so I'm just going to come out with it. He stared at her, concerned. He wondered how this was going to play out, but it seemed like the right card to play at this point. Elizabeth stared at him now. He had her rapt attention. She felt warm all of a sudden. I really think the vampires plaguing New Orleans are staying in the attic of the convent. What? That's not possible, Elizabeth said, feeling a sickness in her stomach all of a sudden. She had no idea he was going to say something like that. No, that day we were up there, I could feel something, but that damned light bulb blew out. I didn't have my flashlight, but I should have gone and gotten it from my bag. He stared at her intently and noticed she was fidgeting with the bedsheet. He also noticed a glimmer of sweat gathering at the top of her forehead. I really just don't see it. How could that be happening with all of us in the convent day and night? Elizabeth replied, trying to conceal the quiver in her voice. She coughed. I need someone helping me on the inside. I fear that maybe Reverend Mother Angelica has been compromised and isn't looking out for the best interests of the church." Gabriel wasn't sure about that, but it made sense that the Reverend Mother would need to be involved. At least that is what he told Elizabeth to ease her concerns. "I don't know. I don't know if I could pull off something like that. I'm a nun, after all." Gabriel bit his tongue at her reply. She sure wasn't acting like a nun coming to stay with him at the hotel. That's when it all began to make sense to him. All his concerns about something amiss with her at dinner and their walk by the river. The more he thought about it, she had to be the one working against the church. She made her move on him in the attic in a desperate attempt to distract him from looking too closely. Once his head was free of his obsession with her, Gabriel knew a nun wouldn't have acted the way she did. Her aggressiveness and obvious experience in the ways of love made him feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. It was during his interview with the Reverend Mother when he was told about the trunks up in the attic. She told him how odd it was that the 7 nuns arrived with such large caskets, and though they had plenty of room up in the attic for them, their sheer weight made it difficult for the staff to get them up the steep staircase. The nuns were emphatic about them being placed up there, and she was so desperate for their help at the convent, the Reverend Mother didn't want to argue. She assumed the trunks weren't doing any harm out of the way in the large attic. "All I need is for you to get me that key. Do you know where she keeps it?" Gabriel said, looking into her eyes. "Yes, it's under the flower pot on her desk. I've seen her put it there." Elizabeth thought her only play here was to make him think she was his ally. "Good. I'll let you know when I'll need it," he said, wondering if she was on to him. "All right, my love," she replied, and in her mind she knew Gabriel St. Pierre must be stopped at all costs. They kissed each other, but their thoughts were of the attic and those 7 trunks arranged along the west wall. Part 9. Elizabeth was halfway up the steep staircase heading for the attic. Gabriel was at the stair landing. She knew it all by the way the floorboards squeaked when he stood before the locked door. She gave it the signal to the nuns to follow her up the stairs. She wasn't sure what Gabriel had in mind, but Elizabeth wanted to bring all the help she had at her disposal to stop the vampire hunter from performing his duties. At 8 p.m., she found the Reverend Mother in her room reading the Bible before bed. She did this every night since they'd been at the convent and turned her light out at 8:45 p.m. before going to bed. Elizabeth burst into the room and strangled her with a piece of rope. The Reverend Mother fought valiantly, despite her advanced age, but died on the floor with her distorted face a deep purple and the Bible in her grasp. Elizabeth couldn't afford to have the Reverend Mother getting in the way of what she had planned for Gabriel St. Pierre. At the same time, 2 of the sisters entered the rectory where Father Michael lived. He was asleep reading a newspaper in his living room chair near the fireplace. The sister surprised the priest and pushed him to the floor, then strangled him with a piece of rope, as they were instructed to do by Elizabeth. The middle-aged priest awakened, thrashing as they tightened the ligature on his exposed neck. He was not in his priest uniform. Father Michael grabbed his chest and suffered a major heart attack in the middle of the assault. He was face down and dead within 2 minutes as the fire crackled and warmed the hardwood floor. The 6 nuns did as they were told and removed their shoes before climbing the stairs behind Elizabeth. She urged them to be silent so Gabriel would not expect them to attack. Each of the women were nervous at what was about to happen in the attic. They knew the vampire hunter was closing in, and they looked forward to surprising him. All their training and discipline was manifesting itself as they crept silently, with knives in hand. They had murder on their minds. Part 10. Gabriel turned the key and heard the click of the lock. He twisted the door handle. He knew Elizabeth had something in mind. He made sure to load the revolver with 6 rounds and place it in the pocket of his trench coat. He also had the black leather bag filled with his tools, so that once Elizabeth was neutralized, Gabriel could do the work he was there for. He was also sure all the commotion in the attic would awaken the other nuns and the Reverend Mother. There would be a lot of explaining to do. The familiar stale smell wafted into the stairwell as the door creaked open. He decided it best to not turn on the light in case Elizabeth remembered the light bulb was out and had it replaced. He wanted the attic to be dark for his plan to work. He had a good flashlight in his kit to help locate the trunks. His heartbeat was pounding as he gingerly entered the attic and made a hard right behind the table he saw the first time, piled with boxes and other items. He didn't notice the handful of marbles Elizabeth had spread across the wood floor of the attic. She hoped he would find himself in the dark and down to the floor before he realized what had happened. He suspected she wanted him to stumble aimlessly in the dark only to slip and fall, so he pushed over the table toward the middle of the attic and it fell with a huge thud on the wood floor. The boxes and their contents fell in all directions. They appeared to be Christmas decorations. Gabriel was crouched and ready as he steadied his breathing. He placed his finger on the trigger of the revolver and waited for his trap to snare the young woman posing as an Ursuline nun. Part 11. A loud bang sounded in the attic as Elizabeth made it to the landing. The other 6 women were only a breath behind. She was surprised Gabriel had not tried the light switch. She had a surprise in store for him if he had. But from the sound of things, he stepped on the marbles she spread out for him to slip on. Now the 7 young women could overpower the vampire hunter with their sharpened knives. They were ready for him. She would love to call her contact in Gasson and bring the good news that the mighty Gabriel St. Pierre was dead. It would be cause for celebration. Elizabeth led the way into the attic. She saw the table tipped over and the boxes strewn on the floor and wondered where Gabriel had landed. She didn't see him. The other 6 women were in the attic now and looking in all directions for the vampire hunter. They couldn't locate him and squinted instinctively in the darkness as their eyes adjusted. Their grips were firm on the knives in their hands, waiting to strike. One of the nuns pushed the knob and tube switch on the wall by the door, and a large flash and explosion rocked the attic. Elizabeth had drilled a hole in the top of the bulb, filling it nearly to the filament with a black powder. She learned of this trick while they were studying in Gasson. She could have told them all about it, but forgot. Now 2 of the nuns that were closest to the light bulb were on fire and screaming on the floor, thrashing from side to side as the others attempted to put the flames out. The acrid smoke of the burnt black powder filled the air. Their charred bodies quivered on the floor for a moment in a death rattle. The 2 nuns were dead. The explosion had been an unsuspecting distraction that Gabriel needed. Elizabeth frantically looked for him. Where had he gone? Suddenly, the deafening crack of the revolver came from their right as Gabriel used the limited light from the stairway to guide him. He had not expected the other nuns. He was also surprised at the explosion of the light bulb, but it was helpful to him as he only had 6 bullets and there were 7 young women looking to kill him. He continued to squeeze the trigger as 2 more nuns fell to the floor. Then another. One more rose to her knees, but fell as the bullet struck her in the chest. The knives they held fell to the wood floor. "Gabriel!" Elizabeth screamed out. She staggered toward him, blood running down the front of her tunic. He must have hit Elizabeth in the right shoulder. Her arm hung uselessly at her side. She kept coming. Gabriel looked and saw no other women still standing. He knew that Elizabeth was hell-bent on taking him out. He forgot to count how many rounds he had shot and hoped he had at least one more bullet to put into her forehead as she inched closer to him, out of her mind with pain. She was running on pure adrenaline at this point and raised the knife in her left hand high as she let out a chilling primal scream. The pistol clicked as he pulled the trigger. He was out of bullets. "You son of a bitch!" Elizabeth cried out as she lunged at Gabriel, grunting like an animal. He had his black bag open by his side and took out one of the sharpened wood stakes with the silver tips. As the young woman dove at him with the butcher knife raised high, Gabriel held up the stake firmly in his grasp and pushed the sharpened tip into her sternum and twisted it. She screamed out as the wood stake went through her body, the hot blood pouring down his hands and forearms. Her impaled body convulsed. Horrible sounds emitted from her as she gargled on blood. Elizabeth quivered for a moment before she fell dead to the attic floor. Gabriel stood up, shaking from what had just happened. It appeared all the women were dead. He was covered in blood, but was happy it wasn't his. He suspected Elizabeth was the enemy, but he had no idea the other nuns were in on this as well. He fully expected the Reverend Mother to arrive in the attic after hearing the gunshots. So far, she hadn't shown up. Now he took out his flashlight so he could get to the caskets before the vampires awakened. He certainly didn't want to fight all 7 of them at one time. Gabriel was able to quickly find the 7 trunks along the west wall. He grabbed the leather bag and made his way to the furthest one on the left. His anticipation of this moment was palpable. Sweat poured down his face in the excitement of the events that led to this moment. It was also a warm attic since the boiler was turned up with the cold temperatures outside. Bare galvanized steam pipes looped around the perimeter of the attic. He knelt down and opened the trunk quickly so as to surprise the sleeping vampire. To his shock, the trunk was empty. He could smell the soil that was placed inside to line the bottom. Where had the vampire gone? This was not what he expected to find. He was ready to drive the stake into its heart to kill the evil, symbolically nailing the vampire to the casket, preventing him rising from the dead each night. Now Gabriel stood up and spun around, shining his light around the attic. He only saw the plywood floor and exposed wood beams above. He continued to span the attic and saw the bricks of the chimney that went on through the roof. No sign of the vampire. Gabriel moved to the next trunk and flung it open, a sharpened stake in hand. Once again, there was no vampire sleeping inside. He repeated this over and over, but all of the trunks were empty. Could he have been wrong? Or had Elizabeth awakened the vampires before he arrived so they would be safely away? He hadn't seen the red mist outside the convent when he approached it earlier, but admittedly, he hadn't been looking. He assumed they would be sleeping in the caskets. He always saw the red mist at 10:10 p.m., and no sooner. This made no sense, as Gabriel knew the vampires were usually creatures of habit and liked to stick to a schedule. Gabriel ran to one of the windows and opened the shutters. He was shocked to see a thin red mist moving across the grounds. It appeared to be creeping toward the building. He ran to the opposite side of the attic and looked out one of the windows and saw the same red mist on that side. Was the mist moving toward the attic? It was too early for the vampires to return. They wouldn't be back to the convent for several hours. His mind raced as sweat stung his eyes. He wiped it away with a handkerchief. He could hear the pinging sound from the sweating steam pipes. Gabriel stood in the window watching the red mist gather and thicken as it made its way closer to the building. He strained to hear a faint groaning and didn't know what it was. He had no idea the mist was filled with the thousands of vampires the Seven created since arriving in New Orleans. These new vampires were faithful servants to their masters, the ones who slept in the Ursuline convent attic. They were summoned from all over the United States to help their masters on this night, and they were ready to serve. Gabriel had never encountered something like this. As he gazed upon the dead bodies of the young women and the 7 empty trunks, he didn't know what to do. He glanced out the window again to see the red mist thick as a cloud and slowly moving up the stucco-covered walls of the convent. The moaning and groaning kept getting louder. He could hear it on the staircase and the steps creaking as something moved closer to the attic. Above his head, he could hear banging sounds and a furious clawing. Suddenly, he saw a hand burst through the roof decking, frantically reaching for whatever it was looking for. Gabriel couldn't believe what he was seeing. Wisps of the red mist filtered into the attic. It sounded like hundreds of angry fists pounding on the roof as he could see dozens of hands and arms flailing in the dark, trying to get to him. They could smell him, and the red mist thickened like a blanket across the floor. Gabriel was completely surrounded by the hellish racket. What sort of diabolical monsters were coming for the vampire hunter? Would he be able to stop them? He only had 7 stakes in the bag, 1 crucifix, a Bible, and a wood mallet. It would not be enough to stop this evil horde from taking him. Now there were many more arms reaching for Gabriel through the roof. He heard the loud splintering of wood. Some were now falling into the attic with a thud. Red mist poured in with them. Strangely, his vision flickered and white flashes sizzled through his head. He wasn't able to see clearly through the mist like usual. The infernal creatures wanted him and would stop at nothing. They were hideous demons with empty stares and rotting gray skin falling from bone. There were men, women, and even children among them, an army of vampires ready to feed. They continued to move closer as he backed up as far as he possibly could in the southwest corner of the attic. The infernal horde pulled the shutters from the windows. As the glass shattered, more of the mist poured in. They ripped and tore at the wood frame windows and began to climb inside. Their groaning was horrible, a deep guttural sound that terrified Gabriel. He had never heard anything like it before. The final gasp of the vampire having a stake driven into it wasn't nearly as awful as this. There were 6 windows on each side of the attic, and the beasts had infiltrated them all. There was no escape. Gabriel turned in horror to see a procession of the vampires coming up the attic stairs and through the doorway, reaching for him as they crept across the plywood floor. The entire attic was filled with them, and the sound was deafening. Gabriel's eyes were open wide in complete shock and disbelief at what he was seeing. There were simply too many of them to count. His vision continued to flicker, and it was nearly impossible to see through the dense cloud of red that had swirled around them. With his back completely into a corner, Gabriel was surrounded by the vampire army. Empty stares, the decay and rot, and dead hands grasping at him. The mighty vampire hunter now cowered. Hands bursting from the roof were clawing at his face, tearing skin, and the blood that flowed only incited the infernal beasts into a blood frenzy. They bared sharpened teeth as they got closer and closer. Their teeth sunk into his flesh, and they fed. No one would hear the screams of the vampire hunter as the red mist engulfed the Ursuline convent on Charter Street. Visitors to New Orleans would continue to see vampires out in the night, hunting for prey. Some would tell stories of the blue-eyed dead man in an English wool bowler hat with awful scars on his face, roaming the French Quarter, looking for someone on whom to feed.